Picture this: a flickering torch casts long shadows across a stone-walled hall, where hushed whispers mingle with the rustle of velvet robes. But tonight, the nobility hasn't gathered for another lavish feast or royal decree. Instead, they've come in secret, drawn by something far more dangerous: a play, not just any performance, but a carefully crafted story woven with hidden barbs, its lines laced with rebellion. This was the power of medieval theatre, not mere entertainment, but a silent dagger aimed at the heart of tyranny. Behind the grandeur of castles and the pomp of courts, these secret performances became the spark that lit revolutions, proving that even in the darkest ages, art could be a weapon. Think about the courage it took to stand before the most powerful figures of the time and deliver lines that mocked their greed or exposed their cruelty, all disguised as harmless drama. The playwrights and actors of these underground performances risked everything: a single misinterpreted metaphor, a too obvious allegory, and the consequences were dire. Yet they persisted. Why? Because theatre became the voice of the voiceless, a way to rally the discontented without ever drawing a sword. The stage transformed into a battleground where ideas clashed, where the oppressed could see their struggles reflected and their hopes kindled. What made these plays so explosive wasn't just their messages, but their cleverness. They danced on the edge of treason, using symbolism so rich that the uninitiated saw only a fable, while those in the know recognized the call to action. A tale about a greedy wolf might really be about a tax-hungry king. A story of a peasant outsmarting a lord could be a blueprint for resistance. And when the final curtain fell, the real drama was just beginning, because these performances didn't end with applause. They ended with whispers in the streets, with secret meetings, and sometimes with uprisings that toppled thrones. This is the forgotten power of medieval theatre, not just to entertain, but to change the world. And over the next minutes, we'll uncover exactly how they did it. These hidden performances often unfolded in the most unexpected corners of castle life: a secluded chapel, a noble's private solar, even the great hall after the servants had been dismissed. The settings were intimate, the audiences carefully chosen. A lord might invite fellow nobles to witness a play that, on the surface, seemed like harmless entertainment. But beneath the polished dialogue and elaborate costumes lay a dangerous game of double meanings. Take the tale of the Fox and the Crown, a popular allegory where a cunning fox outwits a vain lion king. To the untrained ear, it was just a fable, but to those weary of their ruler's excesses, the message was clear: power could be challenged, even by the seemingly powerless. What made these performances so effective was their deniability. A noble could always claim ignorance if accused of sedition. After all, who could prove a children's story about animals was really about the throne? This plausible doubt gave playwrights and patrons alike a thin but vital shield. Yet everyone in that candlelit room knew the truth. The laughter was a little too knowing, the applause a little too fervent. These weren't just plays, they were rehearsals for dissent, a way to test the waters of rebellion without overtly rippling the surface, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. In an age where speaking against the crown could mean losing your head, theatre became the perfect disguise. A jester's whimsy, a minstrel's ballad, even a mummer's silent gesture, all could carry coded critiques. The very absurdity of the medium made it potent. Who would suspect a troupe of traveling actors of plotting revolution? Yet their stories traveled farther than any rebel's manifesto, slipping past guards and spies to plant seeds of defiance in taverns, markets, and eventually the public imagination. By the time authorities realized the danger, the ideas had already taken root. This was the genius of medieval political theatre. It weaponized ambiguity. A single performance could unite disparate factions under a shared joke, a shared grievance, or a shared dream of change. And when the time came, those whispers in the dark would roar into the light. Among these dangerous performances, few were as bold or as brutally effective as the infamous satire of the crowned donkey. Imagine the scene, a noble's hall in 12th century France, where lords and ladies stifled laughter as a braying fool in a makeshift crown stumbled onto the stage. This wasn't just slapstick, it was a direct parody of King Louis VI, whose heavy-handed taxes and clumsy governance had earned him the nickname Louis the Fat. The donkey's ridiculous edicts ordering peasants to pay taxes in acorns or commanding the moon to appear at noon were thinly veiled jabs at royal decrees that felt just as absurd to the common people. What made this play so explosive wasn't just its mockery, but its sheer audacity. Performed under the very noses of the nobility, it relied on a shared understanding among the audience. Every exaggerated bray, every pompous gesture was a signal. We see the truth and we're not afraid to laugh. The clergy, sensing the danger, swiftly banned it. But like fire in dry grass, handwritten copies of the script spread through underground networks. Monks copied it in secret, traveling minstrels memorized verses, and taverns buzzed with retellings. The authorities could burn scripts, but they couldn't erase the idea that a king's power might be as hollow as a donkey's crown. Yet the play's genius lay in its survival. Unlike open rebellion, which could be crushed with swords, satire lived in the space between words and meaning. A lord chuckling at the donkey's antics could always claim he'd missed the subtext, but the damage was done. The laughter itself became an act of defiance, a way to chip away at the aura of invincibility surrounding the throne. And when those whispers reached the streets, they carried a revolutionary thought. If a king could be mocked, could he also be challenged? This was the play's true legacy. It didn't just entertain, it rewrote the rules of dissent. For the first time, ordinary people saw that authority wasn't sacred. It could be ridiculed, questioned, even undone. And though the crowned donkey vanished from the stage, its echo lingered, proving that a well-aimed joke could be sharper than any sword. The peasant's prophecy was no ordinary play. It was a ticking clock disguised as entertainment. Staged in the dimly lit manor halls of medieval Germany, its plot seemed simple. A humble farmer, dressed in tattered rags, stood before a gathering of chuckling nobles and delivered a warning. Unless the lords lowered their crushing taxes, he prophesied, the fields would run red with rebellion. The audience roared with laughter at first, slapping their knees at the absurdity of a dirt-stained laborer threatening his betters. But the joke wouldn't last. What made this performance so dangerous wasn't just its message, but its precision. Unlike broad satires, the peasant's prophecy didn't rely on allegory. It named specific taxes, specific lords, even specific villages where hunger had begun to boil into rage. The playwright had done their research, weaving real grievances into the dialogue like kindling waiting for a spark. And when actual uprisings erupted months later, mirroring the play's predictions with eerie accuracy, the nobility's laughter turned to panic. Suddenly, those harmless lines were a roadmap to revolt, and frantic lords ordered every script burned. Yet the play's true power lay in its timing. It wasn't performed during peace, but at the height of harvest failures, when bread prices soared and patience wore thin. The peasant's monologue, written as fiction, became a rallying cry for real-life rebels who saw their suffering reflected onstage. Villagers who'd never dare speak against their lords could point to the play and say, "See." Even the actors know it's unjust. Art had given them permission to voice the unspeakable, and here's the twist: the nobles' crackdown only fueled the fire. By banning the play, they confirmed its truth. When word spread that authorities were terrified of a mere story, it transformed the script from entertainment into legend. Secret copies circulated hand to hand, recited in cellars and whispered in fields. The very attempt to erase it turned the peasant's prophecy into a symbol proof that words could be as threatening as swords. This was the play's lasting lesson. Theatre didn't just reflect discontent, it could crystallize it. By tying art directly to real-world demands, the anonymous playwright had created something far more potent than rebellion. They'd created inevitability. The Masque of Broken Oaths began as a whisper, a lavish entertainment commissioned by nobles who still knelt before their king, even as their hands tightened around hidden daggers. On the surface, it was just another masquerade, the kind of glittering spectacle Richard II adored. Silk-clad dancers, intricate allegorical tableaus, music floating through candlelit chambers. But beneath the shimmering surface, every gesture, every prop, every line of verse carried a deadly double meaning. The centerpiece was a coronation scene, where an actor portraying Richard received a gilded crown only for it to crumble apart in his hands. The audience gasped, but not from surprise. They knew exactly what that shattered crown symbolized: a king who had broken his sacred vows to rule justly. This wasn't just political theater, it was political warfare. The nobles who staged the masque had studied Richard's weaknesses. They knew his love for pageantry would lure him into the trap, that he'd dismiss the crumbling crown as mere stagecraft rather than a warning. But the message was unmistakable. When a masked figure representing justice turned her back on the king, or when the chorus chanted lines about promises like autumn leaves, the subtext was clear: Richard's reign was living on borrowed time. And the most daring touch, the masque's climax, where a figure representing England herself removed her veil to reveal a face streaked with tears, a direct accusation that the king had failed his people. What made this performance so explosive was its audience. Unlike underground plays meant for peasant crowds, this masque unfolded in the heart of power, performed by nobles for nobles. It wasn't meant to stir rebellion in the streets, but to justify it in the minds of the elite. Each symbolic gesture, the broken scepter, the empty throne, the slow fading of the royal torchlight, was a carefully crafted argument, persuading wavering lords that deposing Richard wasn't treason, but necessity. The masque didn't just criticize the king, it rewrote the narrative of his reign, turning his coronation oaths into evidence against him. And then came the chilling precision of its timing. Staged just months before Henry Bolingbroke's invasion, the masque wasn't merely commentary, it was a rehearsal. When Richard was forced to abdicate, many of the same nobles who'd watched the masque stood in solemn approval, remembering the shattered crown and the weeping figure of England. The performance had done its work, softening the shock of rebellion by making it feel inevitable, even righteous. In the end, Richard didn't fall to armies alone. He fell to a story, one that had been told quite literally to his face. The Masque of Broken Oaths left a legacy far beyond its time. It proved that theater could be a weapon not just for the powerless but for the powerful too, a way to dismantle a king with symbolism instead of swords. And its most enduring lesson: that sometimes the most dangerous rebellions begin not with a shout, but with a carefully scripted silence. Traveling troupes were the hidden arteries of medieval dissent, pumping rebellious ideas from castle to village with the rhythm of their wagons. These weren't just performers, they were smugglers of sedition, their costumes doubling as camouflage. A minstrel's lute case could hide scripts rolled tight as arrows. A juggler's patter might encode warnings about troop movements. And because entertainment was their official trade, no gatekeeper would dare turn them away without cause. What lord would risk appearing humorless or suspicious by interrogating mere actors? Their genius lay in their invisibility. While kings posted guards on roads to intercept rebel messengers, they waved through troops with barely a glance. After all, what harm could clowns and ballad singers possibly do? But these players carried something far more dangerous than weapons: stories. A single satirical song performed in a lord's hall could, within weeks, mutate into a dozen variations sung in taverns and fields. The troupes didn't just spread messages, they weaponized gossip, turning local grievances into shared rallying cries. Take the Brotherhood of the Itinerant Stage, a 14th century troupe that perfected this art. Their signature play, The Miller's Justice, told of a peasant who outwitted a corrupt bailiff through clever wordplay. Performed with exaggerated winks in wealthy households, it seemed like light farce. But when the same script reached villages, the winks became instructions. Audiences recognized the bailiff's mannerisms as their own oppressors, and the peasant's tricks as a manual for resistance. By the time authorities banned the play, it had already spawned 100 imitators, each tailored to mock local officials. Mobility gave these troupes another advantage: deniability. A lord who heard treasonous lines in his own hall could blame the performers and have them whipped, but the next night, those same lines would surface 30 miles away, delivered by different actors in a different dialect. Tracking the source was impossible. Was it the red-haired tumbler or the bass-voiced bard who'd first spoken the dangerous words? The ideas themselves became untouchable, floating free of any single performer's fate. And the troupes knew their power. Some developed elaborate codes. A particular flourish of a hat might signal which version of a play to perform, harmless for loyalist audiences, razor-sharp for restless ones. Others used the chaos of festivals to stage unscripted moments, like accidentally dropping a prop that revealed a noble's stolen goods. These calculated mistakes let them plant seeds of doubt without ever breaking character. Their legacy outlasted the Middle Ages. When printing presses made pamphlets possible, it was often former players who became the most effective pamphleteers, using the same instincts for timing and audience. They'd learned the hardest lesson of all, that the most dangerous rebellion isn't the one shouted in the streets, but the one smuggled into the public mind, laugh by laugh, under the guise of make-believe. A jester's motley wasn't just fabric, it was a map of rebellion stitched in plain sight. Every mismatched patch, every jangling bell, carried hidden meaning to those who knew how to look. The fool's hat with its 3 drooping points, a mockery of the Holy Trinity, suggesting even divinity couldn't save a corrupt ruler. The bells that sounded merry to children's ears. To dissenters, they echoed the clinking chains of oppression. These weren't costumes, they were arguments woven into visual puns, turning the court jester's traditional role as truth-teller into something far more dangerous. And the symbolism ran deeper than mere mockery. A torn cloak worn by a peasant character might seem like simple stagecraft until you noticed the precise number of rips matching the years of a king's reign. A crown slightly askew in one scene could mirror real portraits of an unpopular monarch. Even colors became code. The overuse of deep purple, a dye so expensive it symbolized royal extravagance, might appear garish onstage to highlight waste. The audience didn't just watch these details, they participated in the deception, laughing a beat too long at certain gestures or exchanging knowing glances when a prop was handled just so. This silent complicity turned spectators into co-conspirators. Some symbols crossed borders, becoming a universal language of dissent. The broken wheel, appearing in plays from England to Bohemia, didn't just represent bad luck, it signaled the fragility of power structures. When a character stumbled over a cracked millstone, peasants recognized the jab at their lord's crumbling authority. Even seemingly innocent props held dual meanings. A loaf of bread sliced too thin became commentary on famine. A child's doll missing limbs hinted at war's toll. The brilliance lay in their deniability. What magistrate would arrest an actor for carrying bread? Yet these images lingered in the mind long after the curtain fell, reshaping how people saw their world. The most explosive symbols weren't the obvious ones, but those that targeted specific grievances. In Flanders, a play featured a fishmonger's scales rigged to always favor the buyer, a direct nod to the Duke's manipulated taxes. Burgundy's underground theatres popularized a character who tripped over his own sword, a not-so-subtle dig at the region's warmongering nobility. These localized metaphors gave communities a way to voice frustrations without outright accusation, creating solidarity through shared recognition. When a villager remarked afterward, "That fishmonger scene reminded me of the tax collector," and his neighbor grinned in agreement, the play had done its work. This visual shorthand also protected the performers. A lord might punish an actor for speaking treasonous lines, but how could he prove a red glove symbolized rebellion? The ambiguity became armor. When questioned, players could feign ignorance or claim artistic intent. The crown was crooked, a simple staging error, my lord. By embedding dissent in costume and gesture rather than dialogue, they made repression nearly impossible. Authorities might ban a script, but they couldn't erase the memory of a jester's exaggerated bow to a donkey, or the way a queen character's sleeves dripped with embroidered gold while her subjects wore tatters. And the symbols evolved, staying one step ahead of the censors. When one metaphor became too obvious, troupes invented new ones. A play banned for showing a wolf in royal robes might resurface with a turkey instead, equally vain, equally ridiculous, but legally distinct. This constant innovation kept the language of resistance alive, ensuring that even as old codes were cracked, new ones took their place. The true legacy of these costumes and symbols wasn't just in the messages they carried, but in the collective imagination they nurtured proof that oppression could be outwitted, stitch by symbolic stitch. By the dawn of the 15th century, the church had recognized its mistake. It had underestimated theater's power. What began as cautious disapproval of plays like The Bishop's Folly, with its merciless parody of priests pocketing alms and selling salvation, hardened into outright suppression. Bishops decreed that no script could be performed without approval from clerical censors, who blotted out anything resembling criticism with thick strokes of ink. But the ink smudges told their own story. Authorities weren't just erasing words, they were afraid of them. This crackdown didn't silence the plays, it sharpened them. Forced underground, performances migrated from manor halls to barn lofts, from public squares to forest clearings at midnight. The very act of gathering became defiance. Audiences arrived in ones and twos, murmuring passwords to guards posted at cellar doors. Scripts were memorized rather than written, passed mouth to ear like contraband. And with each layer of secrecy, the messages grew bolder. A play that once hinted at corruption now named specific bishops. Allegories about greedy wolves transformed into direct accusations against tax-collecting abbots. Repression had unwittingly stripped away the subtlety, leaving rebellion raw and unflinching. The church's heavy hand also solved theater's greatest challenge, credibility. When priests denounced plays as the devil's work, it lent them an aura of danger that drew crowds like nothing else. A farmer who might have ignored a satirical jester now leaned forward, thinking if they're this desperate to stop it, maybe the play speaks truth. Censorship became the best advertisement Dissent could ask for. Even those who never saw a performance heard the whispers about scripts burned in public squares, about actors whipped through towns with their tongues nailed to wooden signs. The brutality backfired, transforming obscure plays into legends. And here's the delicious irony. The harder the church tried to control theater, the more it lost control of the narrative. Bishops could ban a play about a corrupt priest, but they couldn't unring the bell. Every confiscated script spawned 10 copies in cipher. Every arrested actor became a martyr, inspiring new troupes. Performances adapted like living things. Dialogue changed nightly to evade censors, with actors improvising lines based on which officials were spotted in the crowd. The repression meant to squash dissent instead forced it to evolve, becoming nimbler, smarter, and more resonant, the ultimate proof of theater's victory. When the church reluctantly embraced it, by the mid-15th century, some dioceses began commissioning their own, approved plays stiff, moralizing affairs about saintly sacrifice. But the crowds yawned. They'd tasted something sharper, something real, and no amount of clerical control could make them forget the thrill of those forbidden performances, where laughter felt like liberation, and for a few stolen hours the powerless held the pen. The silent parliament began with a hush so profound, you could hear the rustle of velvet sleeves as noble spectators leaned forward. On a candlelit stage in 15th century Milan, actors moved like shadows, their faces painted white to exaggerate every expression. No words were spoken, none were needed. The story unfolded in gestures, a circle of counselors raising their hands in mock deliberation, a duke's envoy stuffing his pockets with invisible coins, and finally, the unanimous lifting of fingers to point toward the wings, where a masked figure slunk away into darkness. The audience froze. Everyone understood. This wasn't just theater, it was a verdict. What made the performance revolutionary wasn't its spectacle, but its silence. In an era when even whispered dissent could earn you a midnight visit from the Duke's guards, the absence of dialogue became its own kind of armor. Without incriminating lines to quote, spies sent to monitor the play could only report vague pantomime. The actors, when questioned, shrugged innocently. We merely performed an old fable about a foolish shepherd, but the crowd knew better. The pointed fingers, the exaggerated counting of coins, the way the Duke character's mask resembled the real ruler's profile, these were brushstrokes in a portrait of rebellion, painted so plainly that even the illiterate could read it. And the genius lay in its timing, staged during the annual Feast of Fools, when normal hierarchies were temporarily appended. The silent parliament exploited tradition as camouflage. The Duke's censors allowed it precisely because it seemed harmless, just another raucous holiday diversion. But the laughter that followed each exaggerated bow or greedy gesture had an edge sharper than any sword. By the time authorities realized the pantomime's true purpose, the damage was done. The image of the exiled Duke had already burned itself into the public imagination, becoming a shared fantasy of justice. Weeks later, when bread riots erupted in Milan's streets, protesters reenacted scenes from the play in eerie silence. They pointed at tax collectors with the same deliberate gestures. They mimed tossing coins into the air like the actors had. The Duke's spies, trained to listen for seditious speeches, were baffled by wordless rebellion. How do you arrest someone for a look, a stance, a raised eyebrow? The silent parliament had taught the people a dangerous lesson. That oppression relies on controlling language, but silence could be weaponized too. This was the play's lasting gift. It proved that censorship could be outmaneuvered not through confrontation, but through cunning. A raised hand, a turned back, a slow shake of the head. These became the new vocabulary of resistance. And when the real Duke finally fell from power years later, survivors of his regime would recall how it began, not with a battle cry, but with a room full of people watching in breathless quiet as a masked figure shuffled offstage, his exit as deliberate as a death sentence. Elena of Aquitaine's court wasn't just a hub of poetry and music. It was a carefully guarded stage for political defiance. While her husband waged wars, she wielded something far subtler: patronage. By commissioning plays that mocked greedy lords or praised clever commoners, Elena and noblewomen like her exploited a loophole in medieval power. No guard would dare raid a duchess's private theatricals, and no censor would scrutinize scripts labeled as ladies' pastimes. But behind the silk curtains and delicate laughter, these performances were anything but frivolous. A scene about a wasteful queen might mirror the king's latest tax hike. A ballad about a faithful hound abandoned by its master could echo the nobility's neglect of their people. The very dismissiveness that let women host these plays became their greatest weapon. Female playwrights took even greater risks, disguising rebellion in domestic metaphors that male censors often overlook. Take The Loom of Lies, a now-lost play attributed to a Toulouse countess. On the surface, it followed a peasant woman weaving a tapestry, but each tangled thread represented a broken royal promise, each snipped strand a cancelled treaty. When the character finally held up the finished work to reveal a grotesque, misshapen crown, the message was unmistakable: poor governance unravels legitimacy. These weren't just clever analogies, they were survival tactics. By framing critiques through women's tales of hearth and home, playwrights bypassed suspicion. What lord would interrogate a metaphor about embroidery? Yet the subtext stung all the sharper for its subtlety. The influence of these women extended beyond content. It reshaped theater's very mechanics. Noblewomen's salons became safe havens where dissident playwrights could refine scripts under the guise of literary gatherings. Their manor kitchens fed traveling troupes. Their couriers smuggled scripts between castles in bundles of fabric or baskets of spices. And when authorities grew wary, female patrons perfected the art of misdirection, hosting a seditious play alongside a baptism or wedding, ensuring witnesses would later swear they'd only attended a family celebration. Perhaps their most enduring innovation was the silent chorus, a technique where female actors mimed reactions while male performers delivered safer lines. A noblewoman character might dramatically faint upon hearing a king's decree, or slowly turn her back during a lord's speech, guiding the audience's interpretation without uttering a treasonous word. These gestures, small enough to deny but potent enough to resonate, transformed passive spectators into active interpreters. The real drama wasn't on stage, it was in the shared glances between neighbors as they decoded the meaning behind a dropped handkerchief or an abruptly extinguished candle. This quiet revolution didn't just challenge kings, it upended the medieval world's assumptions about whose voices mattered. When a duchess's commissioned play inspired tax protests or a brewer's widow's allegory became tavern talk, it proved that power could be questioned from the margins. And the play's survival in handwritten copies, often bearing feminine script or hidden in sewing boxes, tells its own story, that the pen and the needle could be as mighty as the sword. The Knight of the Burning Mirror didn't just hold up a reflection to Burgundian society, it forced viewers to step inside it. Picture a lone knight striding onto the stage, his armor not polished steel but hundreds of tiny mirrors, each angled to catch the candlelight and throw it back at the audience. Every noble in that hall suddenly saw their own face staring back from the warrior's breastplate, warped and multiplied, a visual shock that turned spectators into unwilling participants. This was no accident of stagecraft. The playwright's message was deliberate. You are not just witnessing injustice, you are wearing it. What made the play so unsettling was its psychological precision. Unlike satires that mocked rulers directly, The Knight of the Burning Mirror targeted something far more volatile: the quiet complicity of those who benefited from inequality. The knight's monologues weren't speeches, they were accusations disguised as questions. when you dine on venison while your baker starves, whose hunger feeds you. If my armor shows you a thief's face, do you break the glass or the habit? Lines like these slithered past defenses, lodging in minds long after the performance ended. The brilliance lay in making critique personal. A lord might dismiss a jest about corruption in general, but seeing his own reflection superimposed over a beggar's tattered cloak. That stuck. The play's climax weaponized silence. As the knight knelt center stage, his mirrored visor opened to reveal nothing. An empty helm. The implication was devastating. Those who refused to see their role in injustice were as hollow as the armor itself. Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by something more dangerous quiet. That silence, thick with recognition, was the playwright's true victory. Because when the lights came up, viewers didn't just leave entertained. They left unsettled, glancing at their own hands as if seeing them for the first time. Authorities initially underestimated the play's power. Unlike overt calls to rebellion, this drama left no slogans to ban, no treasonous metaphors to censure. Its danger was subtler. It made oppression a choice rather than a fact. By the time Burgundy's duke grasped the threat, copies of the script had already crossed borders, adapted by troupes who replaced the knight's armor with local symbols. In Flanders, he wore a cloak of ledger pages. In Provence, a helmet fashioned from communion wafers. Each version asked the same corrosive question: how much of this suffering is yours to undo? And that question proved impossible to suppress. Unlike rebellions put down by swords, this one unfolded in the privacy of conscience. A merchant might reduce a debtor's interest after recalling the play's images. A lord might hesitate before evicting tenants. Small acts, perhaps, but together, they eroded the myth that injustice was inevitable. The Knight of the Burning Mirror didn't just reflect society's flaws. It showed something far more revolutionary, that those flaws had faces, and those faces could change. Consider the minstrel strumming his lute in a crowded tavern, singing a tender ballad about a maiden's stolen kiss. To the untrained ear, it's just another love song, but lean closer. That maiden's name, Matilda, the same as the rebellious countess exiled the year before, and that stolen kiss, a well-known euphemism for the seizure of her lands. This was the art of hidden dissent set to melody, where every sighing refrain could carry the weight of a manifesto. Music's power lay in its ambiguity. A nobleman might applaud a troubadour's lament about a rose plucked too soon, never realizing the rose was a fallen rebel, his name encoded in the rhyme scheme. The same song, passed from village to village, would subtly shift. A word changed here, a verse added there, until the original meaning became common knowledge, all while keeping the composer's hands clean. Melodies traveled faster than rumor, leaping over castle walls and guard posts with ease. A king could ban a pamphlet, but how did one confiscate a tune already lodged in 1,000 throats? The cleverest composers exploited musical conventions as camouflage. A descending minor scale might symbolize a falling crown. A sudden key change could mirror the instability of a regime. In one infamous example, the Ballad of the Black Swan used a recurring dissonant chord whenever the titular bird appeared, a barely perceptible unease that mirrored listeners' growing discontent with their rulers' taxes. The real stroke of genius, the dissonance only resolved if audiences joined in the final chorus, turning passive listeners into active participants in the songs, and by extension, the rebellion's resolution. Sacred music provided another unlikely vessel for rebellion. When church authorities forbade secular critiques, composers smuggled them into hymns. A psalm about deliverance from bondage took on new meaning when sung in regions under oppressive lords. Carols celebrating a light in the darkness became anthems for resistance when performed in winters of famine. Even Gregorian chant, with its rigid structure, hid barbs elongating certain syllables could turn Domine salvum fac regem, Lord save the king, into a sarcastic drawl that bordered on blasphemy. The true test of these musical codes came when authorities caught on. In 1426, the Duke of Savoy banned any song mentioning nightingales after realizing the bird had become shorthand for rebel messengers. But bans backfired spectacularly. Soon, every tavern ditty about larks, thrushes, or even crows had audiences winking. The symbolism had splintered into infinite variations, making censorship impossible. This was music's ultimate rebellion, not just to carry messages but to teach people how to listen between the notes, and the legacy endured. Long after medieval uprisings faded, the techniques lived on in work songs, protest hymns, and even children's rhymes. A melody might outlive its composer by centuries, its original meaning forgotten, but the instinct to encode truth in beauty, that proved harder to erase than any decree. Because when words are silenced, music still finds a way to hum the unspeakable. The scribes never saw it coming, their quills outpaced by clanking metal letters that could replicate treason 100 times before breakfast. When the printing press arrived in the late 15th century, it didn't just change how words were made, it shattered the monopoly on who got to hear them. Suddenly, plays like The King in Rags, once confined to whispered performances in back rooms, could be inked onto cheap paper and slipped into merchants' ledgers, tucked between hymn sheets, even folded inside shipments of wool. A single performance that might have reached 50 people could now, in printed form, ignite thousands, and the authorities, they panicked because rebellion had just learned how to multiply. What made printed plays so dangerous was their democracy. Handwritten scripts were treasures, painstakingly copied by monks or wealthy patrons, easy to control, easy to burn. But printed pamphlets were like dandelion seeds. A crate of harmless almanacs smuggled into London might contain 50 copies of The Miller's Revenge hidden beneath farming advice. A bookseller in Antwerp could discreetly hand a banned play to a customer wrapped in plain paper, labeled as a devotional text. The very mundanity of printed material became its armor. How could censors possibly scour every page in every shop when the words could be anywhere or everywhere, and the plays themselves evolved to suit their new medium? Without the need for elaborate staging, playwrights leaned into biting dialogue and provocative stage directions that readers could visualize. The King in Rags didn't just mock royalty, it included wood-cut illustrations of a crown crumbling into coins, a visual shorthand even the semi-literate could understand. Footnotes disguised as scholarly commentary drew parallels to current events, turning each pamphlet into a primer for dissent. Readers didn't just consume these plays, they performed them in their minds, casting local officials as villains and themselves as heroes. The real shift, though, was in the audience. For centuries, rebellious theatre had been a game of cat and mouse between elites, nobles mocking kings, clergy skewering bishops. But printing brought these ideas to the merchant class, the guilds, the literate farmers. A cloth trader reading the tacksman's folly might not have lands to lose, but he had ledgers full of unfair tariffs to resent. A baker's wife memorizing lines from The Oven's Heat, a play about grain hoarding, could recite them to neighbors at market. The stage expanded from candlelit halls to counting houses, from castle courtyards to cobblestone streets. Authorities scrambled to respond. Printing houses were raided, presses smashed, and unlicensed printers branded as criminals. But bans only made the pamphlets more coveted. When Paris outlawed The King in Rags, copies began appearing with false title pages proclaiming them devout prayers for humble rulers, a joke that doubled as camouflage. In Germany, printers used interchangeable type to swap out risky passages when inspectors arrived, like a literary shell game. The harder rulers tried to suppress the flood, the more it found new channels. Inside, hollowed-out loaves of bread, sewn into the linings of pilgrims' cloaks, even rolled inside barrels of ink meant for official proclamations. The most lasting change, though, was invisible. Every time someone unfolded a crumpled playbill and recognized their own struggles in its lines, the idea took root that power wasn't divinely ordained. It was a script that could be rewritten. And when those readers gathered to recite band plays in tavern back rooms, they weren't just audiences anymore. They were actors in a revolution that hadn't yet learned its name. The printing press hadn't just spread plays, it had turned an entire continent into a stage. The Baker's Dozen wasn't just a play, it was a dare wrapped in laughter. Set in a village suspiciously similar to the ones where audiences lived, the story followed 12 bakers who, when confronted with yet another grain tax, simply added a 13th loaf to every batch. A baker's dozen for the Duke's men, they'd wink, and 12 for the rest of us. The joke was deliciously subversive. If the crown demanded a share of every loaf, why not redefine what a loaf meant? Night after night, crowds roared as the bakers onstage outwitted tax collectors with flour-dusted cunning, turning the simple act of baking into an act of defiance. What made this comedy so explosive was its timing. Premiering in the summer of 1489, just as real-life grain riots erupted across Flanders, the play didn't just mirror unrest, it weaponized humor to unite protesters. Villagers who'd hesitated to resist now had a script. When actual bakers began shorting loaves for tax collectors or accidentally burning shipments bound for noble estates, they'd quote the play's lines with exaggerated innocence. "Oh dear, must have lost count," just like in that silly farce. The humor became camouflage, making rebellion feel less like treason and more like communal inside joke. The genius lay in its simplicity. Unlike allegories that required decoding, the Baker's Dozen was literal. Its central metaphor, a loaf of bread, was something every peasant understood. When the lead baker declared, "A man's hunger counts the grains, not the crown," the line wasn't poetic, it was a calculation. Audiences left not just entertained, but armed with a new way to think about their own resources. And the title itself became code. To ask for a baker's dozen at market might mean splitting grain stores among neighbors. To mention it in earshot of guards was a silent salute to solidarity. Authorities initially dismissed the play as harmless folly until they noticed its scenes being reenacted in the streets. Tax collectors reported being handed exactly 12 loaves instead of the required 13. With smirking references to that funny play. When the Duke's men finally banned performances, they missed the point. The script had already escaped the stage. Its lines were scrawled on tavern walls, whispered in mill houses, even chanted by children skipping rope. The rebellion had absorbed the art, and the art had organized the rebellion. By harvest season, the play's most famous scene, where the bakers dump a sack of flour over the taxman's head, had inspired real-life pranks targeting hated officials. Flour became a symbol of resistance, dusting the cloaks of authority figures who dared patrol market squares. The play's ultimate victory wasn't in overthrowing a duke, but in proving that even the smallest acts of defiance, when multiplied across thousands of hearths and ovens, could make oppression stumble. After all, how do you punish an entire village for misunderstanding a baker's math? The Baker's Dozen left a legacy far beyond its runtime. It showed that theater could do more than critique, it could provide blueprints. When art and survival share the same stage, laughter becomes a ledger, and every loaf counts twice. Royal propaganda plays should have been the perfect weapon, a chance for kings to cast their enemies as snarling villains while righteous monarchs triumphed. But the moment those demons strode onto the stage, something unexpected happened. audiences leaned in, not recoiling in horror, but nodding in recognition. Because the rebels portrayed as monsters often bore a striking resemblance to the tax-burdened farmer in the third row, or the weaver whose shop had been shuttered by guild laws. The Crown's attempt to control the narrative became its own worst enemy, exposing just how deeply it feared theatre's power to shape reality. Take the tragedy of the Black Boar, commissioned by Henry VII to vilify a defeated rebellion. On paper, it was flawless, the rebel leader transformed into a literal beast, his followers howling madmen. But the playwright made one fatal error. He gave the boar a speech. When the creature roared about stolen lands and children sold into debt servitude, the crowd fell silent. These weren't the ravings of a monster. They were grievances lifted straight from village petitions. By trying to dehumanize dissent, the Crown had accidentally amplified it. The play was hastily rewritten, but the damage was done. Whispers spread that if the king's own stage admitted these injustices, perhaps the rebels had a point. The backlash revealed a truth rulers hated to acknowledge. Theatre couldn't be puppet-mastered. A king might control the script, but he couldn't control what audiences saw in it. When the lion and the serpent depicted rebels as venomous snakes, peasants noticed how the heroic lion never addressed their complaints, only crushed them. When the Duke's justice showed demons burning fields, merchants recalled real soldiers doing the same during tax riots. The harder authorities leaned into caricature, the more hollow their narratives became. Censorship could erase lines, but not the knowing glances between spectators who'd lived the truth behind the fable. Some rulers tried subtler tactics, funding plays that equated loyalty with divine favor. In The Shepherd's Choice, a peasant who resisted rebel wolves was rewarded with heavenly visions, while those who joined them woke in hell. But these heavy-handed morals often provoked the opposite reaction. After one performance in Burgundy, a butcher reportedly shouted, "If heaven's on the side of landlords, I'll take my chances with the wolves." The line became a local proverb, proof that even the most polished propaganda could crack under the weight of lived experience. The ultimate irony, these royal plays became unwitting archives of dissent. By preserving the Crown's worst fears, the grievances they tried to dismiss as monstrous, they gave future generations a map of where power felt most vulnerable. When historians today study the Black Boar or the Lion and the Serpent, they're not just reading scripts, they're reading between the lines to the truth that made kings tremble, that a play could be more dangerous than an army, because while swords could be sheathed, ideas never slept. The Midnight Parliament didn't just break curfew, it broke the illusion that power was unshakable. Picture this, a moonlit courtyard, its stones still warm from the day's heat, where shadows moved not as servants or guards, but as conspirators. The audience arrived in ones and twos, their cloaks damp with dew from hiding in ditches, and when the clock tower struck 3, the performance began, not with fanfare, but with the scratch of a quill on parchment. This was no ordinary play. It was a reenactment of the Magna Carta signing, the infamous charter that had forced kings to acknowledge limits on their power centuries earlier. But here's the twist, the actors weren't noble lords or bishops. They were butchers, weavers, and millers playing the roles of the very barons who'd once defied a tyrant. The timing was no accident. 3 in the morning wasn't just when spies slept, it was when the night felt heaviest, when the world seemed most malleable. As the actor playing King John hesitated over signing the charter, a hush fell over the crowd. They knew this moment. It lived in their bones. The Magna Carta wasn't ancient history. It was a promise unfulfilled, rights granted then ignored. And when the king finally scrawled his name, the actors didn't cheer. They hesitated. Then, with a collective breath, they tore the document to shreds. The gasp that followed wasn't scripted. It was the sound of recognition. That single act, destroying the symbol of their own rights, forced the audience to confront a bitter truth. Charters meant nothing unless the people enforced them. The play's brilliance lay in its simplicity. There were no fiery monologues, no calls to arms, just silence as parchment fluttered to the ground, and in that silence questions took root. If their ancestors had wrested these rights from a king, why had they let them slip away? If a piece of paper could be torn, could it also be rewritten? Authorities dismissed the play as a harmless historical reenactment until reports surfaced of similar performances in market towns, where villagers tore tax ledgers instead of charters. The Midnight Parliament had done something radical. It turned the past into a mirror by reenacting the Magna Carta not as a distant artifact, but as a living challenge. It asked audiences the most dangerous question of all: what are you willing to lose sleep for? And the answer came not in words but in actions. Within months, townsfolk began quoting charter clauses to tax collectors. Petitions invoking the Magna Carta appeared on church doors. The play's legacy wasn't in sparking rebellion, but in revealing how easily rights could vanish and how fiercely they might be reclaimed, because the real performance didn't end at dawn. It began when the audience walked home, their pockets stuffed with scraps of parchment, each one a silent summons to remember what had been torn and what might yet be sewn back together. Hidden behind a tapestry of hunting scenes in Castle Hartenfels, a narrow corridor squeezed between stone walls led to a space no wider than a coffin stood on end. This wasn't a forgotten storeroom, it was a theater. A single wooden bench faced a sliver of stage, illuminated by candlelight filtering through a lattice of peepholes carved into the tapestry's backing. From the great hall beyond, nobles saw only woven stags and hounds, but through those tiny holes, watchers observed every flicker of reaction as actors performed satires too dangerous for open air. The architecture itself had become a collaborator in conspiracy. These secret stages weren't accidents, they were masterclasses in deflection. At Château de Coucy, builders incorporated a whispering gallery above the chapel, where vaulted arches carried voices from a hidden performance space directly to select ears in the Lord's private pew. In Nuremberg, a rotating fireplace concealed an entire troupe between performances, its mechanism disguised as a blacksmith's bellows. Every architectural trick served two purposes: to amplify subversive stories for those in the know, and to erase all traces when authorities came knocking. The stages could be dismantled into ordinary floorboards, the peepholes covered by sliding panels painted to match stonework. Even the candle smoke was vented through chimneys used for kitchen fires, blending Dissent with the scent of roasting meat. But the true genius lay in how these spaces weaponized the elite's own paranoia. Lords who installed spy holes to monitor servants never imagined actors would use them to study audiences. A performer could adjust lines based on which noblemen leaned forward, which bishop's jaw tightened at certain metaphors. At Heidelberg Castle, records suggest a troupe modified their ending nightly based on coded signals from a pageboy watching through a tapestry of the Last Supper. Judas's face conveniently positioned at eye level with the stage. The very tools meant to enforce control became instruments of rebellion. Some designs flirted with audacity. The Dukes of Burgundy commissioned a floating stage that could be lowered into the castle moat at dawn, leaving no evidence beyond damp footprints. In Ghent, a Guildhall's wine cellar hid collapsible seating that unfolded like a fan, allowing 50 spectators to vanish among barrels if interrupted. These weren't just hiding places, they were architectural sleights of hand, convincing authorities they'd seen everything while the real performance happened in plain sight. The legacy of these spaces lingers in unexpected ways. Modern theaters still use the vomitorium exits pioneered in castle secret theaters passages that allowed audiences to disperse instantly. The term itself is a joke centuries old. While Romans used it for literal purging, medieval players repurposed it as a metaphor for swallowing dangerous ideas. Even the concept of a black box theater finds roots in these hidden chambers, where the only illumination came from strategically placed candles, highlighting actors while leaving conspirators in shadow. Perhaps the ultimate irony, many surviving castle theaters were rediscovered not by historians, but by restorers noting odd acoustics or drafts where none should exist. The stones themselves had kept the secret longer than any human conspirator. When workers at Malbork Castle pried up floorboards in 2012, they found not treasure, but something far more valuable, a trove of miniature stages carved from oak, each no larger than a bread loaf. Tiny enough to hide, sturdy enough to last, a perfect metaphor for the stories they once held, small enough to conceal, powerful enough to outlast empires. The Fool's Treaty began with a jester's exaggerated bow so low his bells scraped the floor before a throne occupied not by a king, but a life-sized puppet with vacant eyes and a slack jaw. "Your Majesty," the fool declared, "I bring terms from your loyal subjects." What followed wasn't just satire. It was a meticulously crafted parody of peace negotiations during the 100 Years' War, where weary villagers watched their lords trade away livelihoods like chess pieces. The jester's treaty demanded children as tribute, farmland as collateral, and laughter as tax, each absurd clause mirroring real concessions forced onto peasant communities. When the puppet king nodded dumbly to every demand, the audience's laughter caught in their throats. The joke wasn't funny anymore. It was familiar. What made the play revolutionary was its timing. Staged in occupied French villages where desertion rates soared, the Fool's Treaty didn't just mock authority, it gave moral permission to flee. A scene where the jester enlisted volunteers by tying strings to their wrists like marionettes struck a nerve. Farmers who'd been drafted into yet another noble's petty skirmish recognized the puppet strings on their own arms, and when the fool cut his strings with a dramatic flourish, declaring, "A treaty signed by fools binds only fools," the message was unmistakable. Some oaths deserved breaking. The genius lay in its double-edged humor. To occupying English troops, it seemed harmless buffoonery, just a clown mocking French incompetence. But to locals, every exaggerated gesture laid bare the war's futility. A bit where the jester weighed sacrifices on a scale, placing a loaf of bread on one side and the puppet king's hollow crown on the other, became a visual shorthand for injustice. Soon, villagers reported deserters quoting the play's lines to justify their flight. One captured runaway allegedly told his lord, "Why fight for a crown that can't even hold its own head up?" A direct lift from the fool's closing monologue. Authorities initially dismissed the play as crude entertainment until they noticed its aftermath. Empty conscription lines, barns where deserters hid beneath haystacks with lines of dialogue scrawled on the walls. By turning desertion into a punchline, the Fool's Treaty had done what no rebel speech could. It made disobedience feel like common sense rather than treason. The laughter it provoked wasn't just catharsis, it was collusion. When an entire crowd guffawed at the puppet king's demands, they weren't just mocking power. They were rehearsing how to shrug it off, and the play's most dangerous twist, it traveled without a script. Troops adapted it on the fly, substituting local officials for the puppet king, regional grievances for the treaty terms. In Brittany, the fool demanded fishermen's nets as tribute. In Gascony, he auctioned off vineyard deeds. This flexibility made it impossible to suppress. Ban one version and another sprouted elsewhere like grass through cobblestones. By the war's end, the Fool's Treaty had become something far beyond theatre. It was a shared language of resistance, spoken in the dialects of exhaustion and survival, proof that sometimes the sharpest weapon against war wasn't a sword, but a jester's smirk. The Black Death didn't just empty streets, it turned graveyards into stages. Imagine actors, their usual playhouses shuttered by quarantine orders, standing atop tombstones with skulls as props, performing for audiences of mourners and drifters. These weren't tales of chivalry or romance. They were raw, biting commentaries where death himself became the ultimate satirist, mocking nobles and peasants alike with impartial glee. Behold the great equalizer, a bone-clad actor would proclaim, gesturing to fresh graves. Here lies the merchant who hoarded grain, and there, the lord who taxed it. Who's richer now? The plague had stripped away pretenses, and theatre seized the opportunity to expose what really lay beneath, a world where privilege meant nothing in the face of contagion. What made these performances so radical wasn't just their setting, it was their timing. With whole villages wiped out and survivors questioning why they'd obeyed unjust rulers, the plays became a mirror for collective rage. A popular skit featured Death as a tax collector, tallying souls in his ledger while nobles begged for exemptions. The punchline: he shrugged and took them anyway. Gallows humor, literally, but beneath the laughter was a revelation. If plague didn't respect class, why should laws? Actors, many of whom had lost families to the disease, channeled grief into something far more dangerous: solidarity. When a graveyard performer declared, "Your silks won't save you, but your kindness might," it wasn't just a line, it was a survival strategy disguised as art. The authorities hated these spectacles for the same reason they couldn't stop them. Banning plays in cemeteries would mean admitting they feared the message more than the miasma. So the performances spread like, well, the plague itself. In Avignon, a troupe staged the dance of equal measures, where skeletons pulled lords and beggars into the same frantic jig. In London, actors recited monologues between mass burials, their voices cutting through the clang of death carts. The plays were short, adaptable, and devastatingly effective. A single scene of a knight stripping off his armor to reveal plague sores could say more about the futility of status than 100 sermons. And then came the twist. The very nobles who scorned these performances began stealing their ideas. When the pandemic waned, court playwrights recycled graveyard themes into morality plays, scrubbing the radical edge but keeping the skeleton motifs. The irony was rich. The establishment had tried to bury pandemic theatre, only to dig it up and dress it in velvet. But the original message lingered in the public memory, not just that death was universal, but that the rules of life might be rewritten. Because when the curtain fell on a plague performance, the audience didn't disperse. They stayed among the headstones, swapping stories of who'd really fed the hungry during lockdowns, or which lords had fled their own people. The stage had vanished, but the script kept going. This was the Black Death's gift to rebellion, proof that when institutions crumble, art doesn't just reflect the cracks, it widens them. And sometimes all it takes is a jester with a skull in his hands to remind the living that every hierarchy is temporary. The Shadow Council didn't need dialogue to ignite rebellion. It needed only a candle and a blank wall. Picture this, a dim cellar in 15th century Mainz, where actors moved silently behind a stretched linen sheet, their exaggerated gestures casting towering silhouettes. To the untrained eye, it was simple shadow puppetry, a mayor and his advisors whispering over a table. But lean closer. Those advisors wore hats suspiciously resembling bishops' mitres, and the mayor poured coins into his own pockets while his shadow grew grotesquely large. The message was unmistakable. Corruption wasn't just happening in back rooms, it was looming over them, larger than life. What made the play so subversive was its loophole of deniability. When authorities stormed performances, organizers shrugged innocently. Who can arrest a shadow? The puppeteers weren't speaking treason, they were just hands between a light source and a wall. Even the script, if you could call it that, existed only as improvised gestures, leaving no evidence to confiscate. This wasn't just theater, it was guerrilla warfare with silhouettes, where rebellion lived in the negative space between accusation and proof. The genius lay in its simplicity. Unlike complex allegories requiring literacy, shadow plays transcended language. A farmer might not understand Latin treaties, but when he saw a shadowy figure sign a document and then kick away a begging peasant's bowl, the metaphor needed no translation. The medium itself became the message. Power operates in the shadows, so why not fight back the same way? Soon, imitations sprouted across the Rhineland shadow councils condemning tax policies in Speyer, mocking clerical hypocrisy in Cologne. Each performance tailored its silhouettes to local grievances, turning anonymous walls into forums for collective venting. Authorities responded with absurd desperation. Some towns banned candles after curfew, forcing performances to use smuggled lamps. In Nuremberg, officials ordered whitewashed walls covered in dark tapestries until clever troupes began projecting onto sheets hung from churchyard trees. The crackdowns exposed the regime's deepest fear, that shadows couldn't be caged because light always found a way in. The play's legacy lingered long after the last performance. Protesters began using shadow gestures as silent signals, a hand mimicking a quill to mock unfair laws, or fingers forming a crown before dissolving into open palms. These weren't just symbols, they were a new vocabulary of resistance, proving that sometimes the most potent rebellions aren't shouted, but sketched in fleeting darkness. And when dawn came, the walls stood blank again, holding secrets only the light could tell. A child's voice carries a peculiar power, soft enough to slip past suspicion, yet sharp enough to plant ideas that linger. In the candlelit halls of medieval courts, noble children became unlikely revolutionaries, their cherubic faces masking the dangerous truths woven into seemingly innocent performances. Picture a boy of 7, dressed in velvet and lace, reciting lines about a king's true crown before an audience of lords. The words sound sweet, almost pious, until you catch the glint in his tutor's eye. This wasn't just a recital, it was a carefully staged ambush where the weapon was the audience's own sentimentality. The strategy relied on societal blind spots. Who would interrogate a child for treason when their lines could be dismissed as naive idealism? A little girl curtsying while declaring, "A ruler's strength lies in empty granaries," wasn't chastised, she was patted on the head. Yet the message, wrapped in lace-trimmed innocence, slithered into the minds of listeners. Parents who'd never dare speak against the crown willingly coached their children to voice critiques, exploiting the unspoken rule that childhood granted immunity. The performances became a game of double deception. Nobles could claim their offspring merely parroted scripture or nursery rhymes, while savvy audiences decoded the subtext. Some plays took the ruse further, scripting roles that weaponized childhood itself. In The Shepherd's Gift, performed at the Burgundian court, a peasant child offered the king, played by a duke's son, a single crust of bread, a transparent jab at famine policies. The duke's forced smile as his own progeny shamed him before guests was the real drama. Other productions featured children as allegorical figures: hope, justice, future, their presence making the themes feel inevitable rather than incendiary. When a toddler representing tomorrow asked, "Will there be bread for me?" even hardened knights shifted uncomfortably. The true brilliance lay in the children's aftermath. Unlike adult actors who might be banished or silenced, these young messengers returned to nurseries and lessons, their words echoing in the ears of powerful relatives. A niece singing a ballad about the mouse who ruled the lion at her uncle's knee could sway him more effectively than any rebel's manifesto. And because the performances were rarely written down, passed instead through whispered coaching, they left no paper trail for censors to follow. The rebellion lived in lullabies and rhyming games, where a skipped rope or clapped hand could emphasize the most damning lines. Authorities faced an impossible dilemma. Punishing child performers risked turning them into martyrs, while ignoring them let dissent masquerade as charm. In rare crackdowns, tutors were quietly dismissed or reassigned, but the damage was done. The children, oblivious to the fire they'd carried, simply learned new lines that in time would prove just as flammable, because the greatest trick of these plays wasn't hiding rebellion in innocence. It was proving that innocence itself could be revolutionary. The merchant's reckoning didn't just unfold onstage, it spilled into the streets, blurring the line between performance and protest. Staged in the very market squares where traders haggled by day, the play began with a familiar scene. A lord's tax collector strutting between stalls, demanding coins with a sneer. But here's where the script twisted reality. Instead of bowing, the merchants onstage snatched back their purses, overturned the tax table, and in a moment that drew gasps, tossed the collector into a barrel of spoiled apples. The crowd roared because this wasn't fantasy, it was fantasy with instructions. What made the play so volatile was its audience. Performed at Guildhall feasts and market closings, the merchant's reckoning spoke directly to the rising power of urban wealth. These weren't peasants with pitchforks, they were linen sellers and silversmiths who'd grown tired of funding nobles' wars through tariffs. The dialogue crackled with insider nods, references to weighted scales for unfair taxes or short measures for skimped pay. Every line landed like a ledger entry, tallying grievances in terms traders understood. And when the fictional merchants formed a market council to replace the ousted lord, it wasn't just catharsis, it was a blueprint. The genius lay in its staging. By performing in actual marketplaces, the play turned everyday objects into symbols. A merchant's scales, usually a tool of trade, became a metaphor for justice when an actor balanced them with a sword on one side and a loaf of bread on the other. The market bell, which normally signaled closing time, tolled like a rebellion's call to arms in the final act. Even the costumes blurred reality. Actors wore the same aprons and fingerless gloves as their audience, making the transition from spectator to participant dangerously easy. Authorities initially dismissed it as crude farce, until tax riots in Ghent and Bruges featured eerily similar scenes. Barrels rolled into tax collectors' paths, merchants locking stalls in unison. The play's most dangerous idea wasn't overthrowing lords, but revealing how fragile their power became when coin purses snapped shut. Guilds, once fragmented by competition, began coordinating market holidays that choked off revenue. Some even commissioned their own versions of the play, tweaking the villain's likeness to resemble local officials. And here's the twist. The merchant's reckoning succeeded where peasant revolts often failed because it weaponized commerce itself. A rebellion could be crushed, but how did you arrest an idea woven into the fabric of trade? When a fishmonger accidentally spilled herring brine on a tax ledger while quoting the play's lines, was it theater or happenstance? The ambiguity became its armor. By the time authorities banned performances, the script had already mutated into 100 variations whistled between porters, scrawled on shipment manifests, even stitched into the linings of money belts. The play's legacy lived in the quiet collusion of marketplace glances. The sudden solidarity of haggling turned to protest, because the real performance didn't end with the curtain. It began when a merchant handed back a customer's change with a wink and a folded slip of parchment, not a receipt, but a line from the play. Revolution, it turned out, could be as simple as refusing to pay. Wearing a cloak with the hood drawn low wasn't just practical, it was part of the performance. For nobles sneaking into rebel plays, the risk of discovery wasn't a deterrent, it was the price of admission. A single misplaced whisper could mean imprisonment, or worse, yet surviving diaries from the period reveal aristocrats boasting about slipping past guards to reach secret performances, their hearts pounding not just from fear but exhilaration. The very act of attending became its own kind of theatre, where the audience played the role of conspirators as eagerly as the actors played theirs. Take the case of Marguerite de Brescia, a Burgundian countess who recorded her midnight escapades in coded journals. Disguised as a merchant's wife, she'd trade her silk gown for coarse wool and rub ash on her hands to mimic laborers' calluses. The filthier I appeared, she wrote, the more exquisite the verses sounded. Her description of a performance of the silent parliament where she sat shoulder to shoulder with actual weavers and blacksmiths captures the paradox of these gatherings. Danger didn't shrink the crowd, it curated it. Only those willing to gamble their status or their lives earned a seat. The authorities knew this allure all too well. In Milan, the Duke's spies reported a curious pattern. The harsher the penalties for attending rebel plays, the more elaborate the disguises became. One nobleman was arrested wearing a leper's bells, the clappers stuffed with cloth to mute them. A group of clerics infiltrated a performance dressed as traveling musicians, their lute cases hollowed out to hide forbidden scripts. The thrill of deception became inseparable from the art itself, a game where the stakes only heightened the reward. But why gamble so much for a play? Because the risk transformed the experience. When every line might be your last, laughter carried the weight of defiance, and silence thrummed with unspoken agreement. A merchant's diary from Ghent describes the electric moment when an actor paused mid-sentence as guards passed outside, the entire audience holding their breath in unison, then erupting in relieved giggles when the danger passed. Shared peril forged a bond no royal decree could break. The legacy of these risky performances lingers in an unexpected place, modern immersive theatre. When audiences today don masks or whisper passwords to enter clandestine shows, they're channeling that same medieval instinct, the knowledge that art tastes sweetest when it's stolen. Because the true power of rebel theatre wasn't just in the lines spoken, but in the silent pact between those who chose to listen. The silent bell tower didn't need words to spread rebellion, it needed only rhythm. Imagine standing in a crowded square as church bells told what seemed like a simple call to prayer. But to those with ears trained to listen, the pauses between strikes weren't random silences, they were letters. A long peal followed by two short ones might spell T and A in a coded system resembling Morse centuries before its invention. Together, the sequence whispered tax across rooftops, a sonic dagger aimed at the crown's greed. This was theatre without a stage, where the steeple became the spotlight and every bell ringer an actor in the grandest performance of all, Dissent disguised as devotion. The genius of the code lay in its deniability. Authorities couldn't arrest a bell for ringing too slowly or too fast, especially when the patterns mirrored legitimate signals, funeral knells, wedding peals, even storm warnings. But rebels added subtle distortions, elongating the gap between tolls just enough to turn a mournful dirge into the word unjust, or speeding up a festive chime to scream rise. The real artistry wasn't in the noise, but in the spaces between the pregnant pauses where rebellion hummed, and the audience, they weren't passive listeners. In city after city, people began gathering in alleys or barns after coded peals, comparing notes like scholars deciphering scripture. A baker in Rouen reportedly kept a tally of bell patterns on his flour sacks, cross-referencing them with rebel broadsheets. In Ghent, children played a game called Bell Tongue, where they clapped out sequences to test who could decode them fastest. The sound became a living language, one that couldn't be confiscated or burned. When authorities finally caught on, their panic revealed the system's brilliance. Banning bell ringing was impossible. Churches needed to mark time and call worshippers. Instead, they posted guards in bell towers, only to discover the code had migrated. Now the pauses between guard shifts carried messages, or the rhythmic hammering of blacksmiths took up the pattern. The rebellion had become a symphony of everyday sounds, impossible to silence without halting civilization itself. The legacy of the silent bell tower echoes in unexpected places. Modern protest movements still use rhythmic clapping or honking car horns to coordinate unwitting heirs to a medieval innovation, because the lesson wasn't just about codes. It was about turning the very infrastructure of control into a weapon. When the bells finally fell silent at curfew, their last reverberations lingered like a promise. Oppression might muffle sound, but it could never stop the silence from speaking. Satirical cartoons in newspapers, viral protest skits on social media, even late-night comedy monologues, each carries the DNA of those medieval castle performances. The tools have changed from flickering torches to smartphone screens, but the playbook remains startlingly similar. Disguise dissent in laughter, weaponize ambiguity, and turn the oppressor's own stage against them. Consider the way modern meme culture mirrors the medieval fool's coded gestures. A viral image of a politician with a donkey's ears might seem like harmless ridicule, but it's no different than the crowned donkey play mocking Louis VI. Both reduce authority to absurdity, making it harder to take seriously. The real legacy lies in the tactics. Just as medieval troupes adapted scripts to local grievances, today's protest artists tailor their work to resonate with specific communities. A street mural in Hong Kong borrows visual metaphors from the Night of the Burning Mirror, reflecting police brutality back at power. A TikTok skit about corporate greed echoes the merchant's reckoning, using humor to expose systemic flaws. Even the concept of plausible deniability thrives. Online activists embed subversive messages in pop culture parodies, knowing platforms are less likely to censor content that could be read as mere entertainment. Unlike their medieval predecessors, modern dissenters exploit the cracks in censorship. When a government bans protest slogans, activists turn to theater. In Belarus, demonstrators coordinate silent clapping. In Chile, crowds perform choreographed dances. These aren't just stunts, they're heirs to the silent parliament, using physicality to communicate where words are forbidden. The same ingenuity applies to evasion. Medieval players swapped wolf allegories for turkeys to dodge bans. Today, creators tweak hashtags or use alt text to outmaneuver algorithms. Perhaps the most potent inheritance is the way both eras weaponized participation. Medieval audiences became co-conspirators by recognizing double meanings. Modern viewers join the act by sharing, remixing, or even starring in protest art. A satirical song about corruption isn't complete until it's belted in streets from Kiev to Manila, just as the baker's dozen spread through tavern retellings. This collaborative spirit transforms art from a message into a movement, proof that the real performance has always happened between the lines, in the moment the crowd realizes the joke's on power. The through line is clear. Whether painted on castle walls or pixelated on screens, rebellion thrives when it wears creativity as armor. Because the goal was never just to mock kings or CEOs, it was to remind everyone watching that no throne, no matter how gilded, is immune to the sound of laughter. These medieval plays were never just stories, they were blueprints for defiance, wrapped in the velvet of entertainment. Think of them as the original viral content, spreading not through algorithms, but through whispered performances and carefully coded symbolism. What made them revolutionary wasn't just their critique of power, but their ability to make rebellion feel inevitable. When a peasant watched the baker's dozen and realized his whole village could play the same trick on tax collectors, theater stopped being escapism. It became a dress rehearsal for real-world change. The true genius of these performances lay in their adaptability. A play banned in one town would resurface elsewhere with swapped characters. A greedy bishop replaced by a corrupt sheriff, a tyrannical king reimagined as a drunken lord. Like a virus mutating to survive, the core message stayed intact while its surface evolved. This wasn't just survival, it was subversion on a molecular level. Authorities could burn scripts, but they couldn't unteach audiences how to spot hypocrisy when it wore a crown. And the legacy, it's everywhere. From political cartoons that smuggle dissent into punchlines to protest chants that borrow the rhythm of nursery rhymes, modern resistance still follows the medieval playbook. Consider how a meme ridiculing a dictator mirrors the crowned donkey. Both reduce fear to absurdity with a single image. Or how flash mobs, like the traveling troupes of old, use performance to disrupt public spaces without leaving evidence. The tools have changed, but the goal remains: to make oppression look ridiculous before making it obsolete. What's most inspiring isn't just that these plays existed, it's that they work. Historical records show tax revolts quoting lines from the Merchant's Reckoning, or villages adopting the silent gestures of the Shadow Council to coordinate resistance. Art didn't just reflect reality, it rewrote it. When the actors bowed and the torches dimmed, the real performance was just beginning, in the way a farmer might suddenly misplace his grain ledger, or a weaver's loom might accidentally snap when producing cloth for the nobility. Theater had taught them to see the script behind their suffering and to edit it, so the next time you laugh at a satirical sketch or share a protest song, remember, you're part of a tradition that once toppled kings. Because the curtain never really falls on these stories, it just waits for new players to step into